60 people were watching, but not a single person batted an eye. Nobody called for help. No one tried to save McElroy. They all turned a blind eye to this murder. Hi, I'm Yasmin. I tell stories that are either scary or disturbing. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Here is the rest of it. Ken was known by everyone in Skidmore, and he was actually known as the town bully. If someone was walking down the street and they saw him coming down too, they'd just cross the road to avoid him. Apparently this man really deserved to die. Ken McElroy committed over 20 crimes in his lifetime, and he got away with every single one of them except for one, and that was the last one he ever committed. Ken had a pretty rough start to life. He was born in an area called Overland Park in Kansas in the 1930s to parents Tony and Mabel McElroy. Tony and Mabel were tenant farmers, which basically just means that they're farmers who live on the landlord's property. They weren't really financially stable, and to make things even worse, Ken was actually the 15th child out of a total of 16 children to be born. The family moved around quite a bit, and they eventually settled down in an area called Skidmore, Missouri. Skidmore, Missouri is a pretty small farming town, and its current population is estimated to be around 240 people. So it's safe to say that everyone kind of knew each other in the town and neighborhood when this incident happened. When Ken was going through school, it was actually pretty sad. He'd pick on all the kids, and he didn't have any friends for this reason. People thought that he was so nasty because he resented his peers, essentially, for coming from a family of wealthy farmers. School was really not a good time for Ken, and it affected his learning so much to the point where, to this day, people aren't actually sure if he was literate or not. Unsurprisingly though, by the age of 15 he dropped out, and his mean nature and aggression just sort of transferred into adulthood. Things really seemed to ramp up in terms of his malicious behaviour when one day he was at a construction site when he was about 18 years old, and a massive long steel beam somehow smacked him in the head. This left him with chronic pain, but also a possible traumatic brain injury. And I say possible because people don't actually know for sure whether he had a traumatic brain injury. They sort of just speculated because he just started to become even more nasty. He was more erratic, he was more violent, and he just started to terrorize people in the community. Ken was also physically intimidating. He was a big guy. He weighed around 270 pounds, which is around 122 kg. He was about 5'10" with jet black hair and thick ass sideburns that went all the way to his jawbone. To make things worse, he always had a gun on him, and he made a pretty clear point of making it visible in all situations when he was in public. Because everyone was so afraid of him, he'd do things like steal livestock, he'd steal alcohol and antiques, gasoline, even grain, and he'd just get away with it. And these were all kind of petty crimes compared to what he did in the future. Victims were way too scared to testify against him because if they tried, he ruined their lives. Not only this, but he also had the help of a very good defense attorney whose name was Richard Gene McFadden, and he was also the defense attorney for the mob. So he did his job pretty well and got Ken out of trouble at every instance. His crimes started to just get more and more serious as time went on, and he had this sort of confidence about him. He felt like he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it. The first time Ken attempted murder was when he shot a farmer named Romaine Henry twice in the stomach with a shotgun. But Romaine survived to testify against Ken. But he soon learnt that he really shouldn't have done this. Ken made his life hell. He stalked Romaine, he parked outside his house all night, and sometimes put 7 rattlesnakes in his letterbox. Very specific number. Very odd thing to do, but it really scared Romaine, to say the least. He would also just drop death threats just casually. He already tried to kill him once, so Romaine was pretty on edge. Romaine really had enough. He didn't want to put his family in danger. He didn't want to put himself in danger again because he knew that Ken actually did try and kill him. So he just said, you know what, he's not going to press any charges. He'll let it slide. Despite all of this chaos in Ken's life, he was also somehow a father to 10 children, all from different women, He actually met his last wife, Trina McLeod, when he was 35 years old. Sounds pretty normal, but she was 13 years old, and Trina ended up falling pregnant at around age 14. And it was a very one-way relationship, okay? So after having the child, she tried to run away from him because she kind of knew there was something wrong with this guy. But he was really forcing her to marry him. Understandably, Trina's family just didn't approve of him, which is totally fair enough. Her family didn't really understand the severity of their disapproval until Ken also tried to ruin their lives. Well, actually, he did ruin their lives temporarily. He harassed the poor girl's family by setting fire to their house. He shot 2 of their dogs with a shotgun. This guy's just unhinged with a shotgun. He just gets it out at any opportunity and he just wields it around. But in classic Ken fashion, he sent death threats to the family if they didn't allow their daughter to marry him. Eventually they gave in because he wasn't going to stop and someone was going to get killed. So, Trina and Ken got married. Okay, so let that one slide too. He got away with that. But he didn't get away with this last one. Ken pushed the citizens of Skidmore to their absolute limit. Ultimately, this resulted in his own death, but these are the events that went down. Ernest Bowenkamp, or he was also known as Bo, was just a peaceful 70-year-old man who owned one of the local grocery stores. And one day, Ken's children were just at the grocery store. I think it was one child actually. And that child tried to steal some candy or just tried to shoplift in some way. And one of the employees actually caught the child trying to do this, which obviously really upset the child, and she went out running to Trina and told Trina everything that had happened. Trina tried to warn him and basically just tell them that Ken is unhinged and that they should really be careful of whether they're going to sort of react to Ken. But as we know, Ken loves to park outside people's houses and stalk them to intimidate them, and that's exactly what he did to Bo. He had a shotgun clearly visible next to him and he bombarded Bo with death threats. He'd constantly stalk him and make him feel really uncomfortable on purpose, and this happened for months on end. Something sort of clicked in Ken and he just decided to one day try and kill Bo. So he waited outside of the grocery store and waited for Bo to come out, and he aimed his shotgun and shot him in the neck. Bo was in critical condition and he was rushed to hospital, but luckily he survived the attack. Ken was now charged with attempted murder and he was awaiting his trial. But during this time, he just continued to stalk Bowenkamp outside his house. Occasionally, he would even fire his shotgun in the air a few times just to, ramp up the intimidation. Ken's trial day finally arrived, and for the first time, he was convicted. He was sentenced to prison for 2 years, but he was released on a $40,000 bail bond. This meant that Ken was back out into the community and he had to behave himself because he was actually on bail. Of course he didn't do this though, and shortly after getting released, one night he was spotted at the D&G Tavern, which was the town local pub essentially. He stormed into the place and he was armed with a bayonet and a rifle, and he basically just announced to everyone at the pub that he was going to murder Bo. Clearly, people were pretty alarmed and Ken was arrested for this again. But pretty soon after his arrest, he was released. And this wasn't really much of a punishment. It was basically just a slap on the wrist for Ken. It got to the point where no one could even walk around in peace because this guy was just popping up everywhere in town. It was clear that the law and justice system had just failed the people of Skidmore. So the residents of Skidmore planned an emergency meeting, and that was held at the town's Legion Hall. They basically wanted to find a way that they were all going to still feel safe while McElroy was still around out in the community. Some big guns even came to the meeting, so the town sheriff and the mayor came to the meeting. No one really knows what they talked about in this meeting, but once it was dismissed, it seemed like everyone had a plan put in place because they went straight to the D&G Tavern, which just happened to be where Trina and Ken were that day. So the group of 60 residents just sort of ambushed the tavern and they were surrounded around it just waiting for Trina and Ken to enter their car in the car park. They took a few hours, they finished off their drinks, they finally made it outside. They got in their pickup truck, shut the door. Ken was pretty relaxed when he got in the car. He lit up a cigarette and Trina, just as he did that, looked behind the seat and that's when shots were fired. Trina instinctively opened up the door and leapt out onto the ground for safety. And this is when she realized that her husband had been shot dead in the back of the head. And just like that, Ken Rex McElroy was dead at the age of 47. So this whole time, keep in mind, 60 people were watching, but not a single person batted an eye. Nobody called for help. No one tried to save McElroy. They all turned a blind eye to this murder. Although everyone knew who the murderer was, no one has ever come forward to say that they killed Ken. I mean, obviously I didn't know Ken, I've never seen him be awful to anybody, but it raises a lot of questions as to how people act in a group, but also what people do when they're so desperate. So keep in mind there were 60 witnesses and no one came forward. It just goes to show how desperate these people were and how sad it was that they were harassed by this guy for so long and nothing happened to put him behind bars and keep him there. That's the story. I just wanted to say a big thank you if you watched all the way until now. Please subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.